Welcome to the Mental Disorder Podcast. My guest today is Ashley Frawley. Ashley is a sociologist at the University of Kent, a columnist at Compact Magazine, and the COO of Sublation Media. Her work primarily focuses on the sociology of emotions and how social problems are reconceptualized as problems of the individual. Ashley, great to talk to you today.
Thanks for having me.
I invited you on the podcast because I wanted to talk to you about a new paper of yours with co-authors called Constructing a Crisis: Mental Health, Higher Education, and Policy Entrepreneurs. And this is pretty different than any other paper we've talked about on this podcast before. It's much more focused on how narratives develop over time around mental health, who benefits from certain mental health narratives. But before we get into the paper, I just want to take a step back and ask you to sort of talk about your field of study, which is the sociology of emotions. When we think about emotions generally, especially as somebody like myself who's more psychology oriented, we think about them as very individual, personal, psychological states, right? And when a psychologist studies emotions, they're often thinking about it that way. So they might think, well, how do people behave differently when they're angry? Or what does it feel like to be depressed? And can you explain for the audience sort of how a sociologist of emotion might study and look at emotions differently?
Sure. So, as a sociologist, I don't think that emotion is a purely individual phenomenon. All cultures have different rules around feeling, different emotions that are acceptable in different contexts, and different feeling rules surrounding, particular phenomena. These things are essentially cultural, I think. Of course, that doesn't mean that emotions don't have an individual psychological side. But as a sociologist, what I'm interested in is a culture's ethnopsychology, the kind of the feelings that are natural to people, the aspects of emotion that are part of the socialization of a person into a particular culture. And to the extent that it is successful, that socialization is successful, it means that it feels natural. The emotional responses to particular events and so on, they feel natural, but they are part of a complex web of meaning and rules around what sorts of things are appropriate to feel. And I think there's a tendency, I don't know, sort of culturally, to think that emotion it's more authentic than the social. The social often appears in cultural discourse as a kind of imposition on a true self, which is experienced through emotion. I don't think that's true. I think that emotion is just as social. It's something that we learn throughout our lives, that it's when it's appropriate to feel in particular ways. And the other thing is that, in particular, I'm interested in emotions as social problems. How emotions come to be in our discursive constructions of social problems, how emotions come increasingly bound up with them, and how they act as causes and solutions to social problems. And a lot of people in my area of research and sociology consider emotion in social problems, but we do it in two ways. One is how how rhetoric is used to elicit a particular emotional reaction. So I'm sure you're familiar with sort of culture of fear and these kinds of analyses, that how fear is increasingly mobilized in social problems rhetoric. You're supposed to be fearful about all of these different things. And I've looked at this a little bit just in my columns around anxiety, that anxiety is constructed as a social problem, but anxiety is also constructed as a desirable trait. You're supposed to be health conscious. You're supposed to be bodily aware. There's like awareness ribbons and awareness days and that sort of thing. And like, as a good citizen, you're supposed to be anxious and aware of everything. So it's like sort of cultivating a desirable emotion within the person, within our social problems rhetoric. So that's sort of one way. And then the other way is emotions as social problems. And there are fewer people that are looking at that. There are, for instance, people working on grief. And then I'm working on positive emotion, how positive emotion has been set up as a social problem.
Right. If I can just sort of give an example that illustrates your point very concretely. If you've ever been around a kid and kids are playing and some kid gets into an accident or hurts themselves or something, it's not totally uncommon for them to kind of look around or look at adults in the room and be like, what should I be feeling right now, right? One time my sister was trying to get ketchup out of a bottle and she smacked herself in the head with the ketchup bottle. And she was very young at this time, maybe 4 or 5. And she kind of looked around the room like, what should be my reaction here, and then eventually realized, oh, like this was a bad thing, and then started crying. And so I think we kind of have that writ large in society, right? Obviously, like emotions are to some degree biological in the sense of, if someone attacks you, yeah, you're going to be angry, right? There's some fight or flight defense mechanism. But a lot of it, especially around things like happiness and sadness and reactions to events, right, that are not, say, immediate threats, is going to have this kind of social aspect to it.
I mean, it's funny that you need to explain that, because as a sociologist, I'm like, obviously, like, it's crazy. Like, obviously, we are animals, but we are so far removed from our animal nature. Like, even just talking about fight or flight, like, well, of course, there must be something there, but like, go to someone like Kenneth Burke or Joseph Gusfield's introduction to Kenneth Burke in On Symbols in Society. He talks about even a torture device, right? What is the proper response? Oh, the natural response to a torture device, right? Well, fight or flight, fight or flight. No. What if you are about to be martyred? What if you think that torture device is your pathway to heaven? You're not, are you going to fight or flight? You can feel an intense sense of bliss, even, right? It depends on he says, how we judge a situation or the meaning of a situation depends upon the entire framework by which we judge it. So there's a whole world of meaning. A rat doesn't have that. A rat doesn't have a whole world of meaning. It gets zapped next to a marshmallow. It hates marshmallows. We have a world of meaning that gives a sense of how we are supposed to respond, what these things will mean to us and how we will eventually feel about them.
That brings us to mental health and the mental health crisis in general. And so I know you've written a lot as well on, happiness movements, self-esteem movements, and things like that, which I'm sure have a similar kind of trajectory to them. But let's just talk, about kind of the mental health movement. So I think mental health has always been, I shouldn't say it's always been, but it's, in the 20th century, it's something that's slowly been gaining more awareness. And you can look at it in different ways. You can look at it as, basically we used to lock mentally ill people up in asylums and keep them away. And then over time, they're more integrated into the community. Over time, people then come to see mental illness as something that, or mental health issue is something that, anybody could have. And then around, say, the mid 2000s, we start to get a situation where it's like, well, 1 in 5 people has, a mental health issue. And I guess that is a pretty good example of how people's reactions to emotions are changing over time, and in fact, very quickly. You are a professor. You are somebody who spent a lot of time in universities, and I assume that both of those two things, the fact you're a professor, but also your interest in kind of these social emotional phenomena is probably informing your interest in looking at how has mental health discourse on college campuses changed in, say, just like the past decade. So maybe we can just talk about kind of this study, and which is tracking that trajectory, showing how mental health on college campuses can go from sort of something that's not a big concern to now it's fully integrated into every aspect of campus life. Can you just talk very briefly about kind of the method that you used for the study, which is, more of I think, a media analysis, policy analysis type method?
Sure. So this was from a bigger British Academy funded project that I did with Catherine Eccleston, Ken McLaughlin, and my PhD student at the time, Chloe Wakeham. And we did interviews with people involved in mental health promotion or counseling services or anything to do with well-being and mental health, particularly sort of embedding it in the curriculum, this kind of thing. So we did interviews, and then we did a discourse analysis of the construction. Keep in mind, this is in the UK, right? So this is, where I'm based and where we were focusing. I could probably do a study on the US. I've been dragging my feet on it. I've been asked to, but I need to kind of recover from the previous book. But I would not be surprised to see that it's a very similar trajectory. And in fact, with most of the things that I study, if not all of them, they tend to diffuse from the United States. But anyway, so we did a discourse analysis of news media constructions of student mental health. And then we also did a policy analysis. We did a qualitative media analysis where we did this kind of theoretical sampling of particular documents that were referenced a lot in the news media, and produced a couple of papers and a chapter. And you're talking about one of the papers from that, which brings together the news media analysis and the policy analysis. So in doing that, we did I don't believe in the paper that you're talking about, we touched on the interviews. The interviews were published in a book chapter for another project that we were kind of involved with. Anyways, so the way that we analyzed the newspaper articles is we did a line by line thematically. It's sort of encapsulate. It's not thematically. What I do is I look for claims and I try to encapsulate the claim being made about mental health, because this is social problems research. Is what I do. So looking at claims, that's my unit of analysis. And I sort of encapsulate the claim in a sentence. And then every time that I see that claim again, I modify the sentence slightly so it encapsulates both claims, or I will put like a subclaim underneath it. And eventually you get a catalog of claims. And then you pull them together under broader themes. And in that way, you can get a sense of, well, what gets repeated over and over and over again. And repetition tells you that there was something that resonated, right? Like I remember years ago when I very first came across happiness discourse, which was my sort of previous project that I was working on. I remember saying I was like, I don't know, 19 or 20 at the time. And I was in university and I used to listen to podcasts when they were sort of the new thing. I used to listen to these CBC radio podcasts. And I remember I'd heard the claim, science studies show money doesn't actually buy happiness. Money doesn't actually make you happy. Now, fancying myself a left-wing punk rock kid, I thought, oh, yes, of course, because I had no clue about Marxism or anything like that. I just thought, oh, yeah, as a left-winger, you're anti-materialist. And I remember repeating this line. I didn't look it up. I never looked at the studies that showed it, but there was something about it that made me want to believe it. Ah, yes. It had a truthiness about it. And I repeated it. I heard it the one time and I repeated it. Well, other people did too. And it was the most common claim in that study that was repeated again and again and again. So in this study, we were interested in, well, what are the most common claims repeated again and again and again? What are the most common solutions? And who are the victims? And and what are the consequences? So we use grounds, warrants, and conclusions. So grounds are statements about the nature of the problem. Warrants are why you should do something, and then conclusions are what should be done. I use this framework quite a lot, but I think it's quite fruitful in terms of making sense of what the problem is in the public sphere, because otherwise you can easily get kind of overwhelmed and people will say things like, oh, well, but then this person said this, and 150 years ago, somebody said this. I'm like, okay, but that was not the thing that the problem became in the public sphere. And what it became in the public sphere, it like sort of what rises to the top is what resonates. It resonates. And what does it resonate with? A particular cultural moment, because I never knew the quality of the studies. I didn't care. I just liked the claim. I liked the way it resonated. There was something about it. And that was, what was it about it that made it resonate? What made me want to repeat it? That was the subject of my first book. So we were looking at kind of what resonated. What is it that people are repeating again and again?
The idea of idea laundering or something, right, is a fascinating topic, because the more you drill down into these mainstream narratives, or not even just mainstream, but also often academic narratives, right, often things pick up steam not because they're necessarily true, but just because they're repeated a lot, right? And there's whole industries of public relations firms and things whose job is essentially to do this, right? And it can be really fun to go through and actually try and locate the original sources of claims and see where things actually start from. So that's what we're going to do here. So your study basically kind of starts around 2013, and it starts with this National Union of Students, which is called the NUS, survey on student mental health. And this is in the UK again, I'm going to say. So 2013, UK, National Union of Students, which is like a big students' union, releases a survey. And can you sort of briefly explain like what this survey was saying and how the media reported on it?
Sure. So the study didn't actually start in 2013. It started, I think we started the data gathering in 2005. That was the first year that we were systematically gathering data. And what I do is I use the Nexus archive, and I look at the first 200 most relevant articles, and Nexus sorts relevance by the proximity of the keywords to the headline and the number of times that the keywords are in the article. And then I manually read them. And if it's more than 50% about that particular topic, then I import them into In Vivo for analysis, creating a sample. But there were very, very few in 2005 onward. So there was almost nothing. And then you get this big jump around 2013, and you get this sort of very concerted effort to begin claims making. And one of the first big, oft repeated surveys was that NUS survey. From 2013. And what's interesting about that is they were fairly careful. The person who put together the data said, this is self-report. It was, the survey was distributed to people in their email, students in their email. And, this tends to produce, if you feel particularly strongly about the topic, you will respond. If you feel so, you don't respond, right? So that alone is going to inflate, self estimates of prevalence, that kind of thing. So they were very clear about that. And then they use self-report. So they said, they asked the question, do you have a diagnosis? So they focused on diagnosis. And it was, I have a diagnosis. I think I could be diagnosed, seeking diagnosis. So they asked, it was focused around diagnosis. And this produced the figure that 20% of university students have a mental health problem. And that was produced by 10% who had a diagnosed condition. And I think it was 8% who thought that they did, and then 2% who were seeking. So this is actually much lower than than the general population of the same age. But not deterred, not to worry. They, in the press release that they put out, the problem that they identified was not that students suffer from more mental ill health than the age-matched population, but that they tended to seek help from for their problems from their peers and from their family. And this they said was very problematic, and they should seek more help. They should seek more help. That was the number, every claim. More funding for mental health services. Students need to seek help, no matter how small the problem is. Years later, when we're doing this research on in counseling services, someone tells me, I'm at a presentation, and someone from counseling services at the university I was at the time, teaching at, where my position was at the time, says, well, the students are coming to us when their dogs die, when they break up with their boyfriend or girlfriend. And I'm like, yeah, you told them to. You told them that that's what they were supposed to be doing, right? And there was this huge drive, no matter how small the problem is, because even a small problem could spiral out of control. They explicitly discouraged self-reliance and reliance on existing networks, explicitly discouraged that. And the other thing was that you could tell that, so this was obviously a survey done for claims making. The purpose was that they were going to launch this. That was their issue. That was their problem that they now had ownership of. So issue ownership is usually a key turning point for a social problem, and it has a bigger chance of being institutionalized. I think it really only has a chance of being institutionalized. That is, being taken up by policy if it is owned by somebody, if it is owned by a organization or a group or something like that. So the NUS took ownership of the issue, along with a number of mental health organizations, and who have an obvious interest in sort of spreading and expanding the domain of their claims and of their sort of ownership of issues. And they had already developed these partnerships, and they put the survey out, timed for release for Mental Health Awareness Week. And you could tell that they wrote up the press release before they had the results, because one of the claims makers, from the mental health organizations, in the press release was like, "Oh, the results of the survey are unsurprising. We know that students are at especially high risk for mental ill health because of the problems, because of the stress of studies and so on." They just assumed that studying is bad for your mental health, that having that stress is a mental health problem of some kind, right? That this wasn't like a normal thing that's just part of life. No, it's a mental health problem. And they assumed that students would be especially vulnerable. But actually, the survey didn't show that. It showed the same or even slightly less prevalence than the age-matched population. So this had to have been disappointing. And I think I'm anticipating your next question, which is that in 2015, they do another survey and they get rid of, and you have to keep in mind, this is after another few years of relentless campaigning about mental health, no matter what problem, and this expanding domain of what constitutes a mental health problem. So that what is a mental health problem? That's a very wishy-washy thing, right? It's pretty much any negative emotion or discomfort. So then in the next survey, they get rid of all the language of diagnosis. Do you consider yourself to have a mental health problem? 80% of the students say yes. 78% of the students say yes, right? Because what the heck does that mean? It doesn't matter. It's not defined. It's whatever the heck. And this is after this relentless expansion. Now that goes, what we would say now, viral. That gets mentioned. It's still mentioned now. I still see it cited. 78% of students have mental health problems. But what's a mental health problem? It's become expanded in that time as well.
Yeah. And it's like even the term mental health problem, right? I mean, for a subset of people, they could explain to you the difference between a mental illness and a mental health issue and a mental health problem. Like they might know, but for most people, they'll be like, I don't know. Yeah, of course. I mean, it's being a student can be stressful, right? There's no doubt about it. I think when I think about these organizations, like say in this case the Students Union, but also the mental health organizations, right? I mean, their incentive is so clear, which is the more people they can get under their umbrella of having a mental health issue, then the more money that they're going to get. But also, like the greater the population that they can then draw from, for events or initiatives or like whatever it might be, interviews, programs. I mean, the more people that are in the mental health group or the mentally unhealthy group, the better for them. And when you think about, so that's their incentive. The media's incentive, right, is they're interested in a good story. University students have about the same mental health as the general population, is slightly better, is not an interesting story. And right, like it's nobody would publish that, but the story of, oh, there's these university students who are on campus and they are having a really hard time and stuff is it's a story that makes it seem like a crisis and makes it seem like you do something. I also think there's like an interesting almost social class aspect to it too, where like we care a lot about the mental health of a university student in a way we don't care about like a normal person, because if there's, say, a suicide of a university student, this is the biggest tragedy, right? It's all over the news, right? Like, oh, how could 19-year-old Jonathan do this? He was a promising student, he was going to be an engineer, versus if it's some nobody, like literally nobody cares. So I almost feel like there's this component to it too, where it's as a society, maybe rightly, but we view universities as a very special, sensitive, protected group, and so like we're very sensitive to any threat to them as a population, as like our best and brightest.
Yeah, so this is something that I talk about in a lot more detail in my book, though I think I touch on it in the paper as well. That I don't talk about it in terms of class, though I think that's obviously part of it. But anthropologists, sociologists, there's a lot of studies of university as a liminal period. So there's lots of urban legends that surround universities because it's betwixt and between, right? It's ludic, it's fun, risky, but it's also dangerous. With that fun, with that in between, with that temporary suspension of norms and behaviors of the rest of society, there's a danger there, right? I always used to tell my students, like, they would come to class in their pajamas, or I'd be like walking down the street and I'd see a student outside in their pajamas. Like that's breaking a code, but you're like, oh, that's a student. That's not a crazy person, right? Because if you see somebody walking around in their pajamas and slippers, you think, oh, because they're breaking a code of how you're supposed to behave in public spaces and how you're supposed to comport yourself. But then you're like, oh, it's a young person, of course. They're on their phone or something, So there's a suspension there, and society kind of knows that. So the university is a liminal time. It is fun, but also dangerous, and that also hits on why the universities themselves were so open and actually led this agenda. The students didn't. they got the students to lobby themselves for an agenda that they had already decided. So that's what happened in the articles. The things, the the suicides that were the most talked about tended to be very young students. But actually, that the number of young students who kill themselves, though terrible, is exceedingly low. It's very low, and it's much lower than the rest of the population. Although I should say, very young people, very, very young people committing suicide is also thankfully very rare. But also following trends in the population, the higher age group, the mature student, actually has a higher rate of suicide than the younger student. But I saw absolutely not a single mature student who had committed suicide was ever mentioned in the papers. It was very, very young students, 19, that sort of thing. Exceedingly rare, thankfully. And in fact, students commit suicide at a lower rate than the age match population, which makes sense. Just basically in terms of what we know about suicide, just going back to like Durkheim, like if you are embedded in something, you don't tend to commit suicide as frequently, right? But that was actually surprising to most people that when those statistics first came out, these from the NHS on student suicide, it surprised people that it was lower than the age-matched population. And it was so surprising that the papers reported it completely incorrectly. They ignored the specific statistical advice. The numbers are very low. Do not draw conclusions on the basis of changes from one year to another, because it's very easy when you have very low numbers to say a number has doubled. You had one, now you have two, it's doubled, right? So when you have very low numbers, but the papers did was they picked the year with the lowest rate and they picked the year with the highest, not the rate, the lowest number and the highest number. And they said, oh, look at that, it's doubled, right? And they weren't looking at rates, they were looking at the number. But university participation has massively expanded in that time. So you have to look at the rate, and the rate has been pretty steady and it's very low, thankfully, right? But people were surprised by that, again, because the idea was that any kind of difficulty, people will just wither. People are just very, very weak. That is human nature. So if you are subjected to a challenge like going to university, obviously you will commit suicide at a higher rate. No, that flies in the face of everything sociologists know about suicide, right? But it's become a kind of cultural prejudice that's just the way human beings are. We wither in the face of difficulty. But the other thing is that, why do we care a lot about the mental health of university students? We'll go back to urban legends. Think of any urban legend. I hope that you'll pick one that I can use, but think of an urban legend you've probably heard in your life. Now, you look young. I'm not sure that we tell urban legends as much anymore. In fact, there's a whole paper in my head forming about this because I see urban legends now online a lot. And I'm like, oh my God, I heard that at a sleepover when I was 12. And here it is like told to me as though, no, this is really true. Happens all the time, ladies. Be careful. Anyway, so tell, have you ever heard an urban legend in your life? Have you ever heard the story of the vanishing hitchhiker?
No.
No, oh my God, it's one of the oldest. My husband tells me a version of the vanishing hitchhiker that his grandmother told him from a village in Greece somewhere. It is such a common story. So someone's driving along the road and they see a hitchhiker, a young girl, sometimes wearing a wedding dress, and picks her up. And she starts telling the driver this whole story. And he takes her home, but when he gets to the driveway of the house, he turns into the back seat, and what happens? Do you know?
She's gone.
She's gone. So you have heard the story, right? And there's all sorts of.
I hadn't heard it.
You just guessed exactly because it follows like a sort of cultural format, a familiar kind of form of storytelling. The twist, right? They pack a punch at the end. Anyways, this story takes many, many different forms, but it's most often a young woman, often on the night before her wedding. And when the man goes to the front door and says, I just dropped your daughter off at the house, but I tried to, but I turned around, she was gone. The man says, oh yes, this has happened many times before. That was my daughter. She died the night before she was due to be married. Something like that, right? Or it's a young father desperate to get home to his wife who's about to have a child. It's the people who are on the cusp. We feel a particular amount of empathy for people who are on the cusp of life, who are just about to begin something. That's the ones that we feel the most, those are the ones we feel the most empathy for. So university students, allegedly, are on the cusp of life. They are supposed to be reaching higher. They're supposed to be making something of themselves. And so when tragedy strikes a university student, it is much, much worse. And especially like nursing students, like we feel a lot because they're going to go and they're going to help society, right? So if you like murder a nursing student, you're going to go to jail forever. Like people will want your hide, and I'm not saying that that's, necessarily, wrong. I'm just saying that that's what we feel as a culture. We feel a lot of empathy for people who are on the cusp. So mental health in universities was particularly likely to be politicized. That's not the only reason by far, but that's one of the reasons why there was a lot of empathy and a lot of concern for the mental health of university students, because the university is betwixt and between, so it's outside of norms, and therefore it's fun but also dangerous, so risky. So there's a little bit of fear there. You're sending your who's reading the newspaper, right? It's not the 19-year-olds, it's the parents. So you're sending your child off, and you're like, oh, this terrible thing I just read in the paper, and that makes people, click, makes people scared. It makes people pick up the paper. And then the other thing is young people, particularly who are on the cusp. So that's another reason why. And then, of course, as I said, the assumptions or cultural assumptions around the likelihood of withering in response to any kind of challenge.
I think what you're getting at here is that universities are very bundled, right? Like there's so many components to them and they serve so many different functions. And so the way that higher education interacts with mental health is also going to be, quite complicated in all these different ways. And like one way that I've certainly perceived it when I was in university, which is not too long ago, is that mental health has also sort of become like a language to negotiate accountability in a way, which is to say, if a student is very stressed out and they're behind on their work and this kind of thing, they can go to a professor and they can say, I'm sorry, I had anxiety this week, or I was like really depressed. And this works in a way that saying I was stressed out or I had a busy week doesn't.
Or I was out drinking.
Right. Or I was out drinking, which could be,
or I have poor
alcoholism.
time management, all sorts of things.
Yeah. And it's like, I think a lot of universities, universities as well are basically under pressure to just pass students through a lot of the time. Like they themselves, put pressure on the professors to not be super strict about these things and just, students are customers, right?
Absolutely. A student would come to me and I was like, if it's a good student and they messed up, it'd be like, well, did you have anxiety? Wink, wink. Like, come on, you got to give me something here. That's the only, and it also, but that's it masks something very nefarious, because what happens is, at least in the UK, we lost a lot of our professional judgment. So when I was a student, this is rather embarrassing, but I used to struggle a lot with deadlines, because I didn't realize this until I was a lot older, but my standard was a lot higher than other people's. I know that sounds like, tooting my own horn or whatever, but I didn't get over this until I read someone else's paper and I was like, this is crap. You're going to hand this in. What is wrong with you? And he's like, well, I don't know. I get B's and C's. I was like, you get B's and well, friggin', I'm fine then. And I just handed whatever. But before that, I thought you had to like be original and do all this sort of stuff. Just madness. Anyway, so I would like hide. I'd hide from deadlines. But the work that I handed in obviously was so good, because it was totally ridiculous about what was the expectation for a second year university student. And thank God back then, professors had judgment and they were like, Ashley, what is wrong? Like, you got to hand your stuff in on whatever you have, just hand it in, just do it. And one professor gave me until August to hand in a paper. And it was a very good paper. I still kind of pull stuff from it every now and then. And it was also extremely formative on me. That was when I read Ken and Malick's Meaning of Race. It changed my entire world. Changed the social construction of race, had a powerful impact on me. It's a very basic idea, but it's the first time I heard it. And so I was also taking what I was doing so seriously, developing as a human being. And the professor could see this and he was like, okay, take the time and do it. I could never do that now for a student. Never. I've tried. I see something special in a student. I try to do everything that I can for them. I can't. So the only avenue that's available for me is like, well, maybe you were anxious, maybe you had some anxiety, maybe you had, that's all that you can do. I can't give a student an extension. I just can't. Students would write to me. I don't know, maybe it's different in North America. Students would write to me all the time, can I have an extension? I say, I can't. Goes to a panel. And the panel needs hard evidence. I can't say, I know who you are. I know you're good. I know you messed up here and it's all right. I'll give you another chance. I can't do that. So yeah, this becomes another language to negotiate accountability, but also to negotiate a loss of autonomy and the proletarianization of lectures as well. It all becomes part of like these frameworks and these lists, and mental health itself became part of frameworks and lists. That's what we talk about in a little bit in that paper, but another one we published called Steering Not Rowing, where mental health just became, people were like, well, you told me to go get help, but there's no help. And they're like, well, here's a framework. Here, go on your phone, and here's an app, and here's some rules, how you're supposed to behave and think and feel and so on. You know, what I actually wanted from you was to think of yourself as risky, put your hand up and say, I am risky, be counted. So the university is like, oh, okay, thank God we dealt with that risk. And here's an app, and here's a framework, and here's, now I'm going to train you I'm going to transform you from a risk to the institution into a benefit to the institution, training you in mental health. And now you can now administer to others like a church. And that's a huge part of it as well.
Yeah, let's talk about that actually. So in the paper you talk about this concept of professional X's, right? And so these are, professional X something. So, oh, I'm X depressed, or it could be X victim. And it's people who basically have a challenge, in this case a mental health challenge, who, basically they seek help from the system, they go through it, and it's not that they get better necessarily, but it's like they improve somewhat, but they're still vigilant about their status as as a mentally ill or unhealthy person. But now, because they've gone through this education, they sort of start to try and help other people. And where does this idea of professional X's come from, by the way? Is that like something that you guys came up with, or is that from a previous theory?
No. So this is a very, it goes back at least to the 90s. But it's something very common in social problems analysis. You will often see these professional X's. So people who were once victims or affected by the issue in some way, who then go on to gain meaning from proselytizing about the issue and converting others or helping others in some way. Now, the interesting thing is that we found very few people who were X depressed. And that's something interesting because there's no exit. Like once you have this mental health issue kind of label, it is important that it is maintained. So they never overcome it. It's a little bit like, and this, at least what I can tell discursively, I'd have to do interviews to see this, how this actually works out in more of these types of people. But it's a bit like, at least when we could see, like Alcoholics Anonymous, where you have to say, I am an alcoholic, even if you stop drinking. And that is actually and this is what, people have used the professional X's to talk about is, people who had suffered from alcoholism. And even like, the medicalization of alcohol was another example of this. But anyway, so the maintenance of that identity and the fact that this person has to continually adopt these practices is a core part of their ability to be a professional X. So they were an X. What the X was that you were part of the problem, but now that you are a professional X, you are now part of the solution. You're now part of the solution. So that's what makes you an X, but you're still affected by the problem. And that gives you the ability to minister to others. So, the people who develop these apps and so on, with a lot of this, there's a huge industry side to it. And I think with the students who wind up becoming part of the part of sort of claims making around mental health, a lot of them went on to found organizations around mental health as well that they started in university. But they will still say like they struggle with their mental health. And this is what I do. These are the actions. This is the self-care that I undertake continually. It's like this sort of continual process. It's a bit like health. Health became, if you looked at diaries of people from 150 years ago, they would talk about like, oh, I've got gout and, this sort of thing. But at least I have my health. A woman who described herself as having uterine prolapse. Thank God that she had her health, because health was something that you had when you weren't literally dying. And now health has been transformed into something that requires constant vigilance, constant awareness, constant practices in self-care. And so young people will constantly talk about the fact that they're not healthy because they eat junk food or something, or they don't go to the gym. So it's something that you have to actively do. So mental health has become the same kind of thing. So mental health is something you have to actively do. It's not just something you have. And that's why I find it very funny that I remember, not even I remember, I could see this in the sampling, but it was like 1 in 20 people suffer from a mental health problem. And then it was, this is the same thing with so many social issues. You see, it's like 1 in 20. No, that didn't get attention. One in 12. No, that didn't get attention. Let's just expand it a little bit because, we're leaving out a lot of people who may not really feel that they're part of the problem, but actually they are part of the problem in ways that they don't quite realize yet. So let's expand the net a little. Let's broaden it out. 1 in 8. Then 1 in 4. And it's like, have you felt any of these emotions in the past year? Ah, yes. Tick, tick, tick. Everybody has a mental health problem. Everybody. And it was so quick. It went from 1 in 20 to everyone will experience mental health problem at some point in their life. Well, yes, if it's like any emotion. In fact, that was the interesting thing about the 2015 survey, that 92% of students considered that they had experienced mental distress or something like that. I can't remember the exact wording. And I was like, wow, when they even included things like got angry. And it was like 7% of students said they hadn't, 1% preferred not to say. So 7% of students had felt literally not a single negative emotion in the past year. I was like, holy, that is incredible. We should be celebrating that. No. So they sort of expanded this, and they throw as sort of a broad and a net as possible.
One of the questions that people ask a lot nowadays is on surveys is, have you experienced, have you been persistently sad for more than 2 weeks over the past year? This is a common question now. It's also like kind of a depression inventory question. And it's, in a way, to me, as somewhat of a moody person, like, it's kind of crazy actually how many people just say, no, I haven't. Like, I literally haven't had two back-to-back bad weeks in a year, right? And I think part of it too is we have to also recognize that the people who are designing these studies or who are involved in it are probably on the moodier side as well. And so they're often going to read into other people's behaviors or lack thereof these sort of, more cryptic, negative emotions and intentions, right? Of saying, well, they're just afraid to come out and really say what they think, or, they're afraid to seek diagnosis or whatever it might be. The other thing with professional, X's, as from what I've seen, is that their existence should really make a lot of people very, I don't know if I want to say very, but highly or pretty distrustful of a lot of the decision making that's made in these contexts. Because just to give an example, I was part of this peer review committee for a Canadian mental health kind of program, and they basically put out an ad saying, we want people who have experience with mental health issues to like be sort of like peer reviewers and come and help us with this. So I thought, okay, I kind of fit that bill, but I'm more skeptical than most people would be, and so why don't I kind of come in and I'll add some, I don't know, ideological diversity or something. And literally, I would say 90% of the other, mental health sort of peer reviewer people, they were all psychology students. I was also a psychology student. They're all, people who kind of now worked for mental health charities, or like, I'm doing this podcast, right? Like, we are not just representative at all of like a normal person who had a mental health issue. And whenever you see anything in the media or in government where they're saying, oh, we reached out to people with lived experience or people who had participated to help us make these decisions, you're not getting just a normal slice of the population with mental health issues at all. You're getting a very ideological, highly educated in this area, very committed group.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing about like these sorts of questions, were you persistently sad for, it inevitably involves a value judgment, which is such an obvious thing to say, but it's amazing that it needs to be said. But it involves a value judgment about us, that you're supposed to be a happy, goal-driven extrovert. That's really what you're supposed to be. I am a melancholic individual. That's just the way that I am. And it's taken me a long time to accept that, because I thought that because it's like, you're supposed to be happy, right? And and like the whole thing of like you're supposed to be happy masks the problematization of the fact that nobody is actually happy all the time and that you can't be, which means that everybody's sick in some way, right? So you're supposed to kind of like go through these sort of like mantras. And I used to put like affirmations on my wall, like, don't save up happiness for the future. Be happy now. This is a fantastic way to make yourself miserable because you're thinking about your own psychology all the time, right? And you're like, oh, why can't I be happy? Yeah, I got nothing to live for. Why aren't you happy? You got no meaning in your life. That's why. But but also I am just melancholic. And a long time ago, I would have been quite prized by my culture. They even prized TB victims because that it was like this like very artistic wasting away and this melancholy and this sort of thing, because it was associated with being like a sort of deep intellectual. No, I recognize too that like because we have such a cultural emphasis on being a cheerful, goal-driven extrovert, I can't be mopey. All right, that's fine. I'm cool with that. But I'm also just not going to be happy all the time. And how I escaped this kind of endless like self awareness that made me miserable was having a meaning beyond myself that stopped me from thinking about my own feelings so much, which is just absolute heresy now. You know, I like Edgar Cabanos. I remember we did this project once. He was sort of at a conference, and he's a psychologist. He's the author of Manufacturing Happy Citizens with Eva Luz. And I'll always remember him sort of staring down at his pipe going, well, I just don't think about my feelings that much. And I was like, that is probably the healthiest outlook that you could possibly have. Just don't think about your feelings that much, because if you do, then you will find them wanting. But that has become part of our sort of cultural ethos, that you're supposed to be thinking about your feelings. That all of these articles that I'm looking at, they're asking you, look inside yourself and find a problem you didn't know was there. And so, you know, of course, I'm going to be sad for more than 2 weeks. I'm sad my whole life. And I find that bearable because I am going somewhere. It's not that meaning makes you happy. It's that makes the suffering that is an inevitable part of life worth it. It makes it worthwhile.
It can be somewhat of a depressing message too, because ultimately what you end up having is you're instantiating psychology, which is supposed to be this descriptive science, as your normative framework. And what you're really saying is I should just be like average, right? Because psychology is all about averages, right? And people who study it over a long period of time, they tend to focus mostly on averages and standard deviations and things, which is, I think, you know, in many ways can be an underrated way to still understand humans. But when you then apply it to like yourself, or you're trying to understand how you should be in the world, you know, most people should probably not be thinking that way, because the average is not you, and you don't necessarily want to be the average. It's not good to just be, you know.
We're all thinking that way. That's Ian Hacking, Taming of Chance. You can't say like normal is a conglomeration of difference, right? But as soon as you create a norm, you are like he has this whole thing about like ortho, like an orthodontist makes the teeth straight. It rights them. It makes them right better. You can't just like create a norm and then be like, oh, but it's fine. No, you are saying, and often quite explicitly in claims making, outside that norm, there's something wrong with you. So then people start to try, you can then say, make me normal. But the normal is a statement about all the difference. So then this is the looping effects of humankind, right? This is the problem. You can't just take all these people like they're flowers. A flower doesn't care what you call it. A human being does. As soon as you start labeling people and saying, this is how most people are, you're like, well, I'm not like that. Yes, well, you are not neurotypical. So now you have this label and this becomes who you are. And it gives you a list and it tells you this is how I'm, and how do you know who you would quote unquote really be without that? There's no really be. Human beings are incredibly variable, incredibly suggestible. But I hate the word suggestible, but I think human variation is the norm. And I feel like we have this ossified sense of what it means to be human, that you just are, that there's an essence to you. And this is what I want my next book to be about, is how we've medicalized socialization. We deny socialization and replaced it with medical categories. And it hides a kind of myth of an innate self that's just there fully formed that society comes and messes with. It's not how it works. Man makes himself. We make ourselves. We are fundamentally different. I am fundamentally different than I would have been if my entire genetic makeup had been produced in the year 1000. Entirely different. The thoughts that seem normal to me, I would never have asked, who am I? Never. I would have never asked, what does it mean to be a woman? I would have known, because I would have been living my mother's life and my daughters would live my life. What we are is incredibly temporally bound, but we have such an ossified, static sense of who you are as a person. And we get it increasingly from our psychological categories, from the ethnopsychology of the culture that tells us who we are.
I think this is a good place to stop. So thank you so much for coming on. What's if people want to follow you, keep up with your work, what's the best place for them to go to?
Sure. I am at Ashley A. Frawley on Twitter, and then I'm also at Ashley A. Frawley on Patreon, where I give a weekly lecture, fully thought out, referenced sort of lecture on what I'm working on that week. So if you want to kind of learn more about, how I think through issues or what's going on in my research, you could have a look there.
Okay, awesome. Well, Ashley, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Well, thank you so much.